Hello and welcome to the first of 5 videos from the Roman Army 2021 UofW lecture on Rome's foes. In this first video, I'm just going to say a few things about Roman views on non-Romans and barbarians, so to speak. And then the next 4 videos will each look at one different kind of foe that they faced. Okay. All right, so, the enemies. Here is the overview I just said. So this is the video on ancient ethnography. The next one, Celts, Gauls, Judea, Sasanians, Huns. A little bit late Roman leaning. So I think I've already shown you this passage from Harry Sidebottom in the Cambridge History of Greek-Roman Warfare, but just sort of go over it again. We talked about information and planning for war. So this does give us some idea of how Romans saw non-Romans. So the frontier of the empire could be seen as a moral barrier. Inside, the arts, discipline, and humanity. Outside were wildness, irrationality, savagery, and barbarity. In large measure, the identity of a civilized member of the empire consisted in being the opposite of a barbarian. But there were tensions and ambiguities in Roman thinking. It was recognized that barbarians were not all the same, as we'll see. Those in the north were generally stupider, but more ferocious than those in the east. Some barbarians, northern or eastern, could be thought of as good and wise. Dio Chrysostom wrote up the Dacians as natural philosophers. There's just a taste of the varied views and how we can think about them. So here's a very famous visual depiction of a barbarian, it's an artistic one, so-called Dine-Gaul. So, of course, the term barbarian comes entirely from... this is Roman perspective, okay, of these people. A word ultimately goes back to ancient Greek and was a word used or that came about in terms of or in the context of Greek interactions with Persians, more or less. The Romans and the Greeks, and the Romans writing in Greek, wrote a lot about other people. This was an important part of, some of their literary culture. So the writing of history, historiography, histories were often filled with little ethnographies, so little descriptions of other people. They also had little digressions on geography and things as well. And so you'd find these little accounts of people, their customs, and so on. And a good part of what we know about many of these non-Roman peoples, and to some degree Greek, non-Greek ones too, come from these ethnographies, which hopefully is already setting off the little alarm bells. We're getting the Roman perspective. Okay, sometimes we do have other evidence we can bring on to balance out, tilt the balance in the non-Romans' favor, but sometimes we don't have as much as we'd like. Okay, so some general points that we need to be aware of. Here's another visual depiction here, early 1st century CE. This is from Trajan's Column. Here we have the barbarians in Decabalus. I just read about many of you wrote about Decabalus because of the Simon the biography. There he is nearing death and a whole bunch of Romans charging towards him. Barbarians often distinctive in art, because of the clothing that they wore, trousers, beards. So you can see a bearded fellow here, maybe Decabalus, trousers, etc. Remember Dine-Gaul. He has no clothes, but he looks a little bit more facial hair there. Okay, now this obviously gets complicated over time as fashions change. But anyway. So a lot of it ultimately goes back to Herodotus, our sources for these non-Roman people. He wrote a lot about Persians and about Egypt, and Scythians too were sort of uber barbarians that get used in other contexts. Serve as a model for later ones. Later on, we get, as an example, in the later Roman history, Ammianus Marcellina, this important historian of the 4th century and just of Rome in general. He writes about Arabs and Huns in quite different ways. Arabs kind of negative, Huns very negative, as we'll see. And so when we look at the evidence for all these different people, we got to be aware of things like topoi and stereotypes, so set ways of describing them with sort of characterized or sort of cartoon-like qualities. And we also need to be aware of dichotomies that existed in Greek and Roman thought. So they, not always, but often thought of things in terms of sort of this more of a line maybe than a spectrum, with Romans on one end and non-Romans on the other. Okay, and civilized more on the Roman end and uncivilized from their perspective, not ours, on the other. Okay, a lot of these stereotypes and so on manifested in the little characteristics and traits we see about different people. And this is a table that I've showed you before as well, but here it is again. This is gives you a taste of the late antique varieties of ethnicity, identity, and the barbarians. So, of course, we get, like, as I said before, things like the squalor of the Slavs, the wrath of the Britons, the harshness of the Pittons, the harshness of the Picts, and then the Britons, hospitality, the Spaniards' cleverness, and the Picts' broad-mindedness. So there's a few there. Okay, so there you go. It gives you some idea of Roman thinking and things that we have to bear in mind when we look at non-Roman people. And these are the foes that go up against Rome, who are often described in Roman texts. So they have a slightly skewed approach from the beginning. There's much more written about this, and there's so much scholarship, and a lot of it's great. And this is just the text. We also have material culture and so on. So it's a big topic. Anyway, that's it for video 1.